Hello and welcome to the third episode of our football flashbacks, whatever we want to call it, the decade flashback for Hull City. And I'm joined by Logan. How are you, Logan?
Doing well, Alex. Good to be back and nice to take another walk down memory lane and remind ourselves of the season that was in 2011 and 2012.
Yeah, definitely. We haven't had a City fixture this week, so it is a welcome chance to talk things City, look back on the season that was 2011-2012. When this episode comes out, probably a week after we've recorded it, we'll have done an episode as well where we'll talk about the implications for the current season with these postponements and that sort of thing. So if you haven't checked that one out yet, be sure to do that. But this episode, we're really focusing on that first half of the 2011-2012 season, which was the second season back in the championship under Nigel Pearson. And interestingly, I think there was only two seasons that decade where we began the season in the league that we finished the season in, if that makes sense. So as in we'd spent last season in the championship, we spent this season in the championship, and we weren't promoted or relegated. Same as I think the season under Nigel Adkins, where we stayed in the championship as well later on in the decade. So a bit more stability this time around for us. No relegation, no promotion, and it was all about sort of stabilizing ourselves in this division. But Logan, I think we're sort of talking just before we went to air that this was a season that, pre-season results, everything else that went with it, there was a lot of optimism around what we could achieve going into that season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going back that far, casting our mind back to the preseason that you're talking about. We were actually undefeated, and in that patch of games, we beat the likes of none less than Liverpool in a convincing 3-0 fashion, which probably was the highlight of that preseason. I mean, other results, we knocked off North Ferriby in the start 4-1. We beat Winterton. We beat Liverpool, as mentioned, and also Bradford and Chesterfield, I think, rounded off our victory. So certainly began that season with a huge element of optimism in the camp. And I guess the fact that the season before, even though it kind of fizzled towards the end, there was a lot of promise there in the fact that we almost did clinch a playoff spot. And so there was no reason to start that season with any real negativity, but rather optimism that it could have been a season that brought much joy for the city faithful.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's probably a hard fact to research, but I think I remember hearing at the time that it could have been our first win against Liverpool in any competition, which obviously a few seasons later we went one better and beat them in the Premier League. But at the time, I think we were saying there was about 20,000 people in attendance, which for a pre-season game is incredible, and clearly would have been a really exciting match for a lot of City faithful to be at.
Absolutely. And the element of that as well that you have to kind of harp on is when we fast forward now and consider the time of what football looks like without fans, particularly the crowd numbers that we've experienced under the recent Alum administration, to see 21,000 people or no less inside the KCOM is a huge feat. And to be getting that for a pre-season game in the second tier of English football is a remarkable achievement.
Yeah. So normally at the start of these, we'll talk through, if we've got a shirt from that season, we'll talk through our sort of memories or motivations behind getting that shirt. But for a few reasons, mainly the little white text that I have above the badge on my shirt, I'm going to talk about that in our next episode, which will be focusing on the second half of the season. We also normally talk about the sort of the context around the season and what happened in this half of the season, but we're going to talk about that at the end because it's going to focus mainly on Nigel Pearson and his movements in and around the club. But instead, we'll start with talking about the key departures in the off-season going into this season. And I guess the main ones to look at in this were obviously Craig Fagan, who'd been with the club through a few different loan and permanent spells from Derby County, and was a really great servant of the club in that promotion season and then again in the Premier League. And Matt Duke as well, who was one of those players who he was the understudy to Boaz Myhill. He got his chance in the second half of that 09-10 season, I believe, and sort of really proved himself to be quite a competent keeper and is a really loyal servant of the club, as most number twos end up being, is that they're sort of quite committed to the club. And He then got his chance in the 2010-2011 season, but then I guess whether it was for wages, whether it was just for sort of refreshing the squad or whatsoever, he then made his way out of the club as well. And I think we alluded to in our last episode, one of the bits of magic from the Allams, one of the few sort of positive elements that we can sort of attribute with them is managing to find a way to tear up Jimmy Bullard's contract and get him out of the club and get his wages off the books. So I guess they were sort of the three key headlining departures of the club in that offseason.
Yeah, the Jimmy Bullard contract, I think, is still something that haunts many City fans, and just seems like probably the most mindless piece of business that was ever made. Granted, Jimmy Bullard was an incredible footballer when fit. I think that it's worth noting that. And he had some promising patches at Fulham, and was just really a player who, I think at the time we signed him, it was almost an element of disbelief to see a player of his caliber, particularly when we found out that he was sticking around in the Championship. So, look, whilst there's some horrible memories attached to that, I still think it was a huge feat to be able to get Jimmy Bullard to put pen to paper. And it's just a shame that contract didn't work out. And obviously, I think it dragged on far too much, and really financially was a huge hit for City. And probably, if we were to look at this thing outside of just the isolated 2 seasons of a lot of kind of inconsistent results, with wages like that on the books, it really probably highlights why they weren't necessarily hugely invested in transfer windows, where we weren't able to add too much more promising talent to the club, because we were simply still in that hangover phase from the Premier League. Craig Fagan was a fantastic steward for the club, as you mentioned, and still remains kind of active on Twitter as well. I know that he still seems very connected to City, and his.
Does he have a role with the youth academy? I think
he may.
I'll just have a look, because I know he was at Southend semi recently, but I thought perhaps he also had a role with our academy now. I'll just have a look at that while you keep talking.
Also scored an incredibly important goal for us in one of the seasons. I believe it may have been against Bolton, and was just one of those workhorse players that really proved himself. Like, you knew, whilst he wasn't necessarily clinical or I guess in that upper echelon of strikers, he just gave, as you mentioned, the affinity that a lot of City fans have with those workhorses. He was a player that certainly fit that mould, and was a fine steward to the club, as I mentioned. The other thing that I still remember Matt Duke from, which is kind of surprising, was I think it was perhaps a FA Cup run with Bradford.
Yes,
maybe a couple of seasons after he left us, and potentially a League Two side at the time. Yeah, I remember they may have beat Aston Villa or somebody big, but they
beat Wigan or someone on penalties or someone like that, I think.
Yeah, and I remember watching that game with huge interest, and just being incredibly happy and delighted for Matt Duke, given the fact that, as you mentioned, another fine steward of the club and a great player when given his chance. So it seems odd that my favourite memory of Matt Duke didn't come in a City jersey, but
Well, he went through a few really tough times with City, because I believe he actually suffered from testicular cancer or something like that during one of his earlier years at the club. So pretty remarkable that not only he was able to overcome that, but that he was able to get back out on the park and continue his career. So, fantastic for him to be able to continue playing through that. And then, as you say, be, a great player, not only for us, but then also for other clubs after leaving City. And actually with Fagan, I've got it back to front. He was with our City Academy in 2018, but then he left in 2019. So he's now the under-23s coach at Southend. So, so he did have a coaching connection with us for a little while. And then, still seems to be quite active on social media following our results, which is great to see. Yeah,
absolutely. Fine player, and fine steward. Really enjoyed watching.
Yeah, definitely. It was also an interesting off season, I guess, because and you sort of alluded to it with the I guess the Bullard finances, that it almost seemed as if the Allams had set us up quite well the previous January with incomings like Fright and Chester and McLean and a few others, and we'd had Jack Hobbs on loan from Leicester, and we made that into a permanent move over the summer. But it wasn't a really prolific summer, which was, I guess, in some ways a really good sign that we'd sort of formed this nucleus of a really promising squad, and we were starting to see the fruits of those labours, and we weren't going out and making big signings and upsetting the squad, but really we were just sort of supplementing it. And so that summer, I guess the main signings that we saw coming in on permanent deals were, as you know, as mentioned, Jack Hobbs, but then also Joe Dudgeon at left back and Corey Evans in midfield. Corey Evans was a really great player for us for that season and the next under Steve Bruce. And him along with Tom Kearney, I feel really sort of, a decent amount of regret, and also with Joe Dudgeon, that they didn't get a good crack of it in the Premier League that following season because, for whatever reason, I guess Bruce sort of ran his rule over them and Corey Evans wasn't deemed up to it. I think Kearney was especially unlucky because he suffered an injury, but and then same with Joe Dudgeon, sort of in and out of the side with injuries. But, all three on their day, very, very promising players for City. And, I guess as saying that as well, Jack Hobbs as well didn't get a go in the Premier League. So really, these three guys kind of came in, had an 18-month, I guess, stint with City, but were all very memorable signings and played quite well for us.
Yeah, and absolutely, as you mentioned, I remember Joe Dudgeon having an incredible amount of promise and came with huge accolades, except for the fact that he did have a horrible run of injuries in the time. I still remember when Steve Bruce came in, he was very positive in his assessment of Joe Dudgeon as well, and really wanted to give him the time and, obviously let him flourish. But as you said, for whatever reason and for a very hindered injury run, he was prevented from doing so. I think, as you mentioned, Corey Evans was a fine player and really, on his day, probably was one of the marquee midfielders in the championship. Was a great passer of the ball, and I still always remember the goal that he scored against Leeds. I think it might have been the season after, or perhaps where we beat them 2-0.
I think that was under Bruce. Yeah.
But fantastic player, and Jack Hobbs as well. Jack Hobbs was one of those kind of no nonsense central defenders that we had a real habit of finding those players. When you think about the likes of Chester and Davies and just the players that have come into the club in recent times, it has been I guess a position that has been one that we've had a lot of success with, and Jack Hobbs certainly holds up in that bracket as one of those really positive signings to play central defence for us.
Yeah, I mean, look, he was fantastic for us. And I remember when I think we then loaned him out to Nottingham Forest after we got promoted and thinking that was a really strange decision. And then we brought in Curtis Davies, and sort of the rest is history, in the sense that, Davies just came on, stepped into the team seamlessly. I guess in hindsight, whether you would have maybe thought of keeping Hobbs on as backup, I'm not sure. It was sort of, I guess, a pretty sort of cutthroat move and one of those moves that I guess sometimes you need to make that step up. Interestingly, I just had a look. Corey Evans moved from us to Blackburn, and he's still at Blackburn, so he's made almost 200 appearances for them. So it's sort of a testament to his quality, I guess, that he's really sort of excelled in that side and really found a place in that side, because being there since 2013, having a 7-year stint at the same club is a pretty impressive one. So. Look, that's really great to see for him as well. Other signings that we brought in over that off-season, I mean, we brought in Dele Adebola, who didn't make a huge impact, I'd say. We seem to have this trend. It started from that season, or maybe even a few seasons before that, where we seem to bring in this sort of obscure striker each season who you sort of look at and you think, they might do okay, but they'd never really end up hitting the ground running. I mean, I think he'd come from Bristol City, where I think he'd actually been relatively decent, but just couldn't get it to happen with us.
I also remember Dele Abdullah, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I remember he also was quite getting on in age when he was signed as well. He was one of the older signings, and I don't think he had a great goal return. He was more seen as one of those kind of hold-up strikers that
it's almost like a Heskey,
That's right, poor man's Heskey, and for him to kind of come into the mould and deliver almost exactly what you would predict. I guess every team on earth has a striker or a 20-goal striker at the top of their shopping list at the beginning of each season. But sadly for us, in the 2011-12 season, Dele was not that man.
Yeah, absolutely. The other really interesting one was, we kind of continued our goalkeeper merry-go-round with bringing in first Adrian Basso. I think was signed on a free contract, but then Peter Galashki came in on loan from Liverpool and looked really average with us. I mean, I think he had a couple of okay games, but on the whole was not particularly impressive. And I just find it remarkable that, he's gone from being, a relatively unimpressive championship lone keeper to now, or at least what he was until recently, the Red Bull Leipzig keeper playing Champions League football for them and looking really impressive. So it's quite a career path for him.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the joys now is as we go back and do these walk down memory lane seasons, to see some of the players that were in the City ranks and how they've kicked on. I mean, we look at Harry Maguire, we look at Andy Robertson, and yeah, as you mentioned with Will Ashke, to see where he's moved on to. It's fantastic that we've kind of been a breeding ground for elite players and are well regarded in the top kind of levels of world football. So, fair play to him. And it would have been nice to see that same when you go back and look at this season and see the amount of games that we did leak multiple goals. But yeah, well done. To see where he's got to credit to him.
And look, it's probably a similar vibe to, we'll talk about Eldon Jakupovic in the following season. Bruce signed him on a free contract and he sort of had a pretty, innocuous debut, or a pretty inglorious debut, and then obviously went on to much better things with City. Another one that we'll talk about in the second half of this season is Josh King, who we got in on loan, sort of continuing our Manchester United conveyor belt of loan signings, who obviously then went on to a really great career so far in the Premier League with Bournemouth. I think he's back in the Championship with them now, but I'm sure a Premier League move either with Bournemouth or with another club isn't too far off. But for this half of the season, one player we brought in on loan was Robbie Brady, who I think, if memory serves me, I think was initially brought in as a left back, not actually as a left winger. And I think it was sort of Bruce who first played him as a left wing back and then further up the field that sort of transformed him. But I think, if I'm not misremembering, I think he was brought in as a left back.
He was brought in as a left back, but as you said, always had the attributes of someone that could play higher up the pitch. And if you remember, not that this is necessarily attached to this season, it was Steve Bruce called Sir Alex before the game against Cardiff that we had to win for our promotion in the draw, and he asked, how would you think about Robbie Brady playing up front? Could he handle it? Would it be a good decision? And Sir Alex Ferguson gave him the nod and said, absolutely. It's a great decision. So I guess that, speaks into the testament of the attributes that Robbie Brady did have. Just an incredible workhorse and looked really comfortable with the ball at his feet. Could skim past defenders and had a great left foot as well. And again, he's still playing for Burnley in the top flight. To this day. Yeah.
Came on for them this morning, I believe, against Leeds. And he scored 3 and 39 for us that season. So if he was playing predominantly left back, that's a pretty impressive return. And you're right, I do remember he certainly played quite a few games up forward for us over a few seasons. So very, very flexible player and a very important one for us as well. We'll now move on to the games from that first half of the season. And we'll talk about Pearsons specifically in a second, but one thing that obviously catches the eye when looking back at the results in that first half is that there's an awful lot of 1-0 wins or 1-0 results in that first half of the season. And I remember when Pearson first came in, he sort of talked about building a defence first and foremost, and then sort of going on and building the attack in the side. And he certainly proved that he built a very solid defence with City in that season. And I think probably part of the reason that he did end up making that move back to Leicester was there was a lot of unhappy mumblings from City supporters about the style of football, the dour football of the 1-0 sort of results. So what are your memories of that first half of that season?
Yeah, I remember this season significantly with the man on screen with Robert Corrin. I think for Christmas that year I got a shirt that was from the Tiger Leisure store, which was "Keep calm and pass it to Corrin." And the kind of theme that kept appearing was he was just very frequently popping up and scoring these late goals for us. And as a testament to the results that we got, it was largely because of him and also Matty Fried. I think he had a huge season goal scoring as well. I think he ended up top scoring the season again for us, which was the same as the previous season. But Robert Corrin's performances that year, he was just a real significant part of the success that kind of kept us again in a playoff push. And of course, Nigel Pearson were taking the reins of City that year. He was kind of a stop-start manager. It was, like you said, the brand of football wasn't exactly as exciting as we would potentially have hoped. But I mean, sitting from this point and looking back, many people were critical of Steve Bruce in the same manner, with the fact that we weren't going out and blocking teams off the park, and it was so much of the 1-0 kind of victories, if victories, otherwise, won or draws. And I think that what we've learned as being part of the kind of football league ride over the last decade is those 1-0 victories, even though they might not always be the most pretty to watch, they are the games that get you promoted. And to have a manager that can instill that kind of defensive resolve, even if you're not watching, fantastic football and great build-up play and well-worked goals, if you're able to get those results on the board and collect points, that's ultimately the thing that gets you into a position to go up. And so for all of the criticisms that many people did have of Nigel Pearson, those late winners and those kind of gritty results that we were getting, it obviously put us in the conversation, at least up until Christmas anyway.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, look, he left after the loss to West Ham, I believe, which was the loss to West Ham put us into 8th. But before that point, we'd spent 4 of the 5 previous game weeks in the playoffs in 6th place. So as you say, quite rightly, it's those sorts of grinding 1-0 results that, yes, they're not necessarily pretty, but that's what you need to do to get promoted, is just to grind out those wins. And you can approach things 2 ways. You can be the Leeds who sort of blow teams off the park and occasionally get completely thrashed. And yes, if you've got the personnel to do that, then that can be the way you go about it. But for other sides, it's about putting together the results and grinding through the games. You sort of talk about, keep calm and pass it to Corrin. Probably the most entertaining game of that first half of the season, and probably the one I remember the most clearly, was actually a 3-2 win over Watford, which kind of, in a season, or a first half of a season of 1-0s and 1-1s and 0-0s, to have a 3-2 win against Watford where Corrin bagged the winner in the 94th minute, was a pretty remarkable game. And I remember it because I think we'd gone down 1-0 to Watford through a Chester own goal, and it was sort of, back then it was sort of, if we conceded a goal, we're pretty unlikely to win the game. We just weren't scoring a whole heap of goals at that point. So I think Corrin then Fried actually equalised just after half time, which sort of got us going. And we sort of traded goals because I think Watford then scored again to go up 2-1. And you got the sense then that, okay, yes, we've come back into the game, but that's probably it. But then McCann, with a pretty rare goal, got one in the 66th to get us level again. And then, in the last minute, Corrin got the winner in the 94th minute. And, we were on the Wise Guys Say episode the other day talking about how back then, you didn't have iFollow, I don't think I even had Twitter. Twitter was sort of just developing, I guess. I just followed results on BBC. They had, on the BBC website, you had the flash version of the scoreboard, so you get sort of live updates of the scores. And I just had that open on my laptop, and so you're sort of looking at the score. It's 2-2, and the clock's running down, and you have no sense of what's going on and whether they're a chance of getting the winner. And then just pops up with Corrin getting the winner, and seeing the highlights afterwards and the quality of the goal as well. It was certainly a great one to win.
Yeah, absolutely. They were very dark times. I can remember on a different note, was the exact same thing, refreshing my browser, and the goal game that we beat Fulham with the Minucho goal. I think when we talk about rare goals, nothing is more rare than Minucho.
Minucho goal, yeah.
In the 94th. But they were incredibly dark times, and I guess that perhaps we're unqualified to comment on some of those 1-0 boring results, is because we weren't privy to being able to actually watch it live, but rather listen to it, or, as you said, check the live feed. So but I do remember that result, and I remember that result clearly, as well as of course the rivalry game against Leicester, where Corrin popped up again later in the season, which that was a great one as well. It's going to be
I guess there's quite a lot to talk about in the second half of this season, because, as you say, there's sort of that spice that was then added, and sort of out of nowhere, this rivalry with Leicester just popped up. Because I guess we'll move on, and that's a good segue into talking about Nigel Pearson and all that went around him that season. Where we got the chance of he was only on loan and all that sort of thing. Where it's one of those rare instances where I really do feel for the. I mean, I guess the Allams didn't appoint Pearson, but we had approached Pearson when we were relegated. The Leicester owners had given us permission to talk to him, and I think that sort of put him offside with them. And he was quite happy to come and sign for us. And he, as we're saying, he'd built quite a promising side. We were pretty much on the cusp of the playoffs. And so for him to then, the Leicester owners then approached the Allams to talk to Pearson, and they said no. And then Pearson essentially forced the move through to go back to Leicester. And you sort of think, for a manager who was sort of shown no loyalty at the previous club to then show no loyalty to the club that's now standing by him, was incredibly frustrating. And you have to wonder if, knowing what we do now about the Allams, whether he sort of caught whiff of any sort of potential issues between him and them, maybe in terms of transfer funds, whether it was in terms of how the club was being run, I'm not sure. But at the time, it was a really sort of devastating blow to what was turning into quite a promising season.
Absolutely. I think you've touched on some really big points there and hypotheticals. We sit here, we could probably come up with some pretty illustrious conspiracy theories as to how things were being run at the club. But obviously Nigel Pearson saw something in whatever package or whatever, contract negotiations that were going on with Leicester for, as you said, for him to leave a club that certainly appeared on the up at that point of the season as well. And he had really built the squad that he kind of wanted. So for him to be entering into negotiations, and I guess the fact that it was not kept a secret at all. I remember watching many of the press conferences and pre-match report with him and the previews, and people would ask him, the reporters would ask him point blank, and he said, "I'm here. This is my club. I don't ask you about your job." And it became really apparent that there was a real edginess to how he answered those questions, which kind of did nothing to squash any of the rumors that were happening. And inevitably, there was a lot to that story. And as you said, in some ways, it was a shock that he did move on so abruptly. But at the same time, the whisperings lasted for a long time, that there was an element of resignation, I guess, from City fans that he was going to go eventually. And, knowing what we do now, that's obviously how it panned out.
Yeah, look, I mean, they were in probably about 13th or 14th spot when they sacked their manager and brought him back in. But yeah, and I remember the press conferences as well, just as clearly as you, where it was, I think, after that West Ham game where his tone or his answers sort of shifted, and there was that real sense that, okay, he's actually going to leave now, because, as you say, he'd been sort of standoffish before then, but something sort of shifted. And look, I think it's an interesting one, because obviously he then took Leicester back to the Premier League, and we went back a season before that with Bruce. So in hindsight, I think it sort of smooths it all over, but as we sort of alluded to before, it created this huge animosity and rivalry between the two clubs for the remainder of that season. And, we had the Allams refusing to deal with Leicester's owners. I remember specifically and famously over Cameron Stewart, and the fact that Pearson wanted to take Stewart back to Leicester with him. And I think offered £1 million, and they sort of said, oh, that'd get him his right foot or something like that. I'm sort of a little bit surprised that guys like Matty Fried and Jack Hobbs actually stuck with us, when quite naturally you would have assumed that they might as well, because Fried only really came across from Leicester to follow Pearson. But then he stayed with us, which was great to see from a City perspective. But in a lot of ways, quite surprising that those players remained loyal to us rather than the manager that had brought them in. You sort of look at someone like an El Mohammadi who followed Steve Bruce around to a few different clubs over his career. So, it's quite natural sometimes that managers have those favourite players. But and we'll talk about in the next episode, obviously the clash with Leicester when Nick Barmby took the reins, but it made it a very, very interesting second half of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably I guess, the hallmark moment, or the thing that, summarizes the deep memories for City fans. When I was asked to reflect on this season, it was straight away the moment that my attention was kind of drawn to. And then obviously for Nigel Pearson too, we know what his appointment at Leicester meant for them too, and the heights that they started to kind of climb once he went across. It was a change in fortune for a club who were very much equal pegging with us for a long time. I think that we had some really good battles with Leicester anyway, and it was certainly a club that I never got the kind of feeling that they were a bigger club than City or anything along those lines. And for the fact that he went back to Leicester and then was able to taste Premier League success and kept them up famously as well, fair play to him. Sometimes it's just a case of, better the devil you know, and maybe there were things at Leicester Football Club that really resonated with Nigel Pearson. Although I believe he was discarded in quite an unfortunate way a little bit later anyway. So I guess for those City fans out there that still do like to hold a grudge, that might have been a moment of satisfaction for them.
Yeah, look, that's a great point. I mean, the karma train on Nigel Pearson, I guess, thinking about it, he's next to English jobs, Leicester and Watford, both very sort of, dismissive sort of sackings in off seasons, where you would have thought that, he'd just kept, but in both cases, really, he'd kept them up in the Premier League. Oh, well, actually, no, sorry. Watford had just been relegated, hadn't they? I think, when he was sacked. But regardless, I think he'd only been there for a couple of, maybe a month or two. To be sacked was quite shocking.
And I guess another side note as well is that it was a really interesting personality kind of trait with Nigel Pearson. He seemed very abrupt and in some ways very short and kind of bossy. There wasn't a real personable element to a lot of his conferences. He wasn't necessarily the most charismatic or engaging manager too. So, perhaps someone like Nigel Pearson is not everybody's cup of tea. But he certainly, could do a job, and if you reflect on him as a football manager now, he's more than capable.
Yes, I think that's the key as well. Is I think I've seen a few comparisons recently between Grant McCann and Nigel Pearson, and the fact that both can be quite standoffish in the media and quite prickly. But I think the distinction is that Pearson actually seems to know what he's doing, and therefore is sort of justified in, keeping his cards close to his chest. Whereas I don't think McCann has the runs on the board to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's probably a fair comment, and I guess the jury is still out on Grant McCann. In the sense that the fact he's still there, even though many people thought he would be gone, and where we sit on the ladder at the moment, what kind of legacy, I guess, will Grant McCann leave with City fans whenever he does part, will be very interesting. If we do a review in 5 years' time.
Yes, absolutely. Be very interesting indeed. Okay, well, I think that's just about it for this first half of the season. We'll probably, in a couple of weeks' time or a week's time, we're sort of in our holiday period at the moment. We might try and get the second half of the season out, because I suspect there's a fair bit to talk about in that half of the season as well. But yeah, so this episode will be going to air on YouTube for everyone, and audio for everyone, a week after recording it. If you're a Patreon of ours, you will be getting it pretty much as we've just recorded it. So I do encourage everyone, if they can, it's the new year. Hopefully everyone's pockets aren't hurting too much from Christmas, but maybe if there's a chance for you to be able to become a Patreon of ours for £3 a month, it would certainly go a long way for us and mean a lot. So that would be greatly appreciated. But otherwise, if you click the bell on our YouTube channel, you'll get notifications whenever we're about to do a live episode or about to drop an episode such as this. But otherwise, like, share, comment. What were your memories of this half of the season? We'll put a poll up, as we always do, probably next week when this episode goes out to the public. We'll probably say, coming into this season, where were you expecting City to finish, given the optimism in that off season, the way the squad had been built. It was certainly an interesting season in that decade to look back on. So thank you for looking back on it with me, Logan.
My pleasure, Alex. It was a joy.
No problem. And thank you, everyone, for listening.